In the early hours of March 2, 2018, the peaceful night at the Shaughnessy home was suddenly broken. The alarm system, turned off remotely, left the house exposed as two people quietly slipped in through a side window. The family dogs, sensing something was wrong, started barking loudly, waking up Ted Shaughnessy. Still groggy but determined to protect his family, he grabbed a gun and headed towards the kitchen. But before he could fully understand what was happening, a figure appeared from the shadows and gunshots rang out through the house. Theodore Shaughnessy was born on February 7, 1963, in Los Angeles, California. He was one of three children born to Teresa and David Shaughnessy, with his brothers Thomas and Timothy completing the family. Although not much is known about Theodore's early years, it's widely recognized that even as a teenager, he was known for being kind, caring, and easy to talk to on almost any topic. He had a deep concern for the well-being of his loved ones. After finishing high school, Theodore became interested in the booming gem and jewelry business in California. He enrolled in specialized training programs offered by the American Gem Society, eventually earning his certification as a jeweler. In the mid-1980s, during a trip to Phoenix, Theodore met a young woman named Corey in a game arcade. Corey, born in 1966 in the small town of Wickenburg, Arizona, had a passion for painting, which led her to pursue a degree in fine arts. She dedicated herself almost exclusively to painting the desert landscapes that surrounded and inspired her. After their initial conversation, Theodore and Corey discovered a shared interest in jewelry design and creation. Their romance quickly blossomed, and Theodore soon moved to Arizona to be closer to her. Under Theodore's influence, Corey began studying gem classification, and together they dreamed of opening their own business. While waiting for their dream to become a reality, Theodore worked at local pawn shops, and once Corey completed her degree, she joined him. In 1988, the couple married, and a few years later, having honed their skills and gained valuable experience, they moved to Austin, Texas, to make their dream a reality. In 1995, the couple finally opened their own jewelry store. Theodore's dedication and passion were evident in every aspect of his work, whether he was on the hunt for precious stones or helping customers find the perfect piece. His patience and care in dealing with customers quickly made the shop a well-known and beloved establishment in the area, earning Theodore a reputation as a generous and kind-hearted individual. Thanks to their financial success, the couple accumulated a net worth of around $6 million, allowing them to build an impressive home on the outskirts of the city. Despite their success, one thing was missing: a family. For reasons not publicly known, the couple chose to adopt rather than have biological children. After completing the necessary paperwork, they received the joyful news in early 2000 that a child was waiting for them in Ukraine. The trip to meet the child was filled with nervous anticipation, but as soon as they saw the little boy, Theodore and Corey felt a sense of peace. His name was Nicholas, and he was 16 months old. Nearly 2 years later, the family of three returned to Austin, Texas, having fulfilled their dream of becoming parents. Nicholas quickly proved to be intelligent and curious, always eager to learn about the world around him. Like his parents, he developed a love for animals, leading the family to adopt 2 dogs. Theodore, who had taken up racing cars for fun, soon brought Nicholas along to the tracks, and the boy quickly shared his father's enthusiasm. As time passed, Nicholas learned to drive with Theodore's guidance, spending countless hours practicing on a go-kart track. His interests also extended to martial arts, where he eventually earned a black belt in karate. As Nicholas entered high school, he developed a fascination with finance and luxury goods, an unusual interest for someone his age. By then, he had achieved his black belt in karate and frequently discussed financial matters with his 2 closest friends, Spencer and Tyler. However, Nicholas's constant need to show off his wealth and possessions made others uncomfortable, including his friends. Despite this, he won the heart of a young girl named Jacqueline, who had moved to Austin from New Jersey after her parents' divorce. Jacqueline and Nicholas started dating, and in 2016, Nicholas introduced her to his family. Although the evening began somewhat awkwardly by the end of dinner, Theodore and Corey were charmed by Jacqueline. Due to the physical abuse Jacqueline suffered at the hands of her father, she found refuge in the home of her boyfriend and his parents. Once Corey learned the reasons for Jacqueline's extended stays, she allowed her to move in with them, and the young couple took up residence in a room on the ground floor of the house. Corey, always nurturing, did her best to care for Jacqueline, and even gifted her a beautiful diamond pendant for her 19th birthday, in keeping with the family's love for gemstones. As Nicholas neared the end of high school, his obsession with making money only grew stronger. He even wrote a detailed article for the school newspaper outlining a plan to get rich by working from home in the stock market. In July 2017, after graduating from high school, his mother agreed to loan him $30,000 to start his own business. A month later, Nicholas and Jacqueline moved into an apartment complex in College Station, about 2 hours east of Austin. Shortly afterward, with the help of Spencer, who had become an ordained minister, the young couple secretly married. Jacqueline focused on her university studies while Nicholas worked from home as a stockbroker. As their social circle expanded, Nicholas never missed an opportunity to brag about his supposedly successful business ventures. In reality, however, things were not going well and he was actually losing money. He borrowed $2,600 from a neighbor, promising to repay her with the profits from his investments. At the same time, Nicholas had to take out other loans that quickly came due, pushing his financial situation to a critical point by early 2018. When Jacqueline learned of their financial troubles, the couple argued and began discussing options to turn things around. What started as a joke about inheriting Theodore and Corey's fortune soon turned into a serious plan. After all, if they were no longer around, Nicholas would be the sole heir to a $2 million life insurance policy, plus an additional $6 million from the business and property. A few days later, the idea morphed into a real project, and the couple even agreed to hire someone to eliminate Theodore and Corey. The first person Nicholas approached for the job was his friend Spencer, but despite offering him $50,000, Spencer refused outright. The couple's initial failures did not deter their determination. On the contrary, by mid-February 2018, Nicholas turned to social media to continue his search for someone willing to carry out their dark plan. He contacted a woman who worked at the complex where he lived, offering her extra money. When she inquired about the nature of the work, he proposed that she kill 2 people in exchange for $20,000 per victim. The woman never responded again, and like the neighbor who had loaned him money, Her identity has remained undisclosed for safety reasons. Nicholas faced similar rejection from a third individual he approached with the offer. Unwilling to give up, on Friday, February 23, 2018, he visited a local bar and struck up a conversation with Johnny Leon, a 21-year-old with a criminal record for drug offenses. After introducing himself and explaining the job, Nicholas offered Johnny $100,000 with payment to be made in installments. As they discussed the details, Nicholas texted Jacqueline to share the good news. When she asked about the cost, he brushed off her concerns. That night, Johnny and Nicholas agreed to meet later at Nicholas's house to finalize the plan. On Monday, February 26, 2018, Corey called her son to ask why he had not yet repaid the loan she had given him. The uncomfortable conversation quickly escalated into an argument, leaving Nicholas feeling even more pressured to achieve his goal. On the morning of Wednesday, February 28, 2018, before meeting with Nicholas, Johnny invited his friend Cameron Bosmek, who worked at a local company, to help with what he described as a moving job. Cameron, unsuspecting of anything nefarious, agreed. When Cameron and Johnny arrived at Nicholas's home, they were caught on the security cameras. Once inside, Nicholas revealed the true nature of the plan. He explained that he would deactivate the security alarm remotely from his phone to allow them access to his parents' home. They were to enter through a window in one of the rooms, where they would find a gun in a drawer. Nicholas offered Cameron $10,000 payable in 3 installments, but as soon as the words were out of his mouth, Cameron walked out, refusing to be part of the plan. Later that day, back home with his family, Cameron confided in his wife about the unsettling incident. Meanwhile, left alone with Johnny, Nicholas offered to accompany him on the mission. That night, they drove to Austin, but after several hours, Nicholas realized he couldn't go through with it, and they returned to College Station. The following day, Johnny introduced Nicholas to Ariane Smith, a 23-year-old who had recently been released from prison after serving time for drug-related offenses. Despite his criminal past, Ariane was willing to join the plan. Nicholas laid out the details again, and they agreed to carry out the attack on March 2, 2018. On Thursday, March 1, 2018, Theodore and Corey finished their usual workday at the jewelry store. After dinner, they went to bed as usual. Meanwhile, Johnny and Ariane exchanged numerous messages, preparing for the task ahead. They met up and drove to Austin, arriving at around 4:30 a.m. Once Nicholas remotely deactivated the alarms, the two intruders entered the house. Following Nicholas's instructions, Ariane retrieved the gun from the designated drawer. However, the family dogs, alerted by the intruders' movements, began barking, waking Theodore and Corey. Still groggy from sleep, Theodore grabbed a gun and headed to the kitchen. Ariane, reacting quickly, fired several shots, hitting Theodore and causing him to collapse. In the chaos, one of the intruders also shot one of the family dogs. The noise from the gunfire prompted Corey to grab her gun. She positioned herself in the doorway of the bedroom and fired down the hallway, determined to defend her home, even though she couldn't see the intruders. Her actions, though they didn't injure the attackers, were enough to scare them off. They fled the scene, leaving Corey to take refuge in a closet where she called emergency services. It was nearly 5 a.m. when the police arrived, delayed because they initially went to the wrong address. During those agonizing minutes, Corey remained on the line with the 911 operator. When the operator finally instructed her to leave the closet and open the door for the officers, both Corey and the police were confronted with the horrific aftermath of the attack on Theodore. He was pronounced dead at 5:14 a.m., and through tears, Corey called her son to inform him of what had happened. As Nicholas and Jacqueline began their drive to Austin, the medical examiner determined that Theodore had died from multiple gunshot wounds. Meanwhile, the detectives initiated the investigation. What struck the detectives the most was the sheer number of bullet holes, both in the walls and scattered across the floor. They were able to reconstruct the attack with precision. Additionally, since only a side window was slightly ajar, they concluded that the intruders had likely used that window as their point of entry. Corey informed them that the window led to her son's former bedroom, prompting the detectives to search the room. In a dresser, they found an empty gun case. Immediately, they wondered if the missing gun had been used in the attack. Corey reported that nothing else was missing from the house and that she hadn't seen the intruders' faces. However, she suspected they knew about her and her husband's line of work. When Nicholas and Jacqueline arrived in Austin around 8 a.m., the detectives noticed Nicholas's unusual lack of concern. Their suspicions grew when, despite not knowing the full details of what had happened, Nicholas went straight to check the window in his old bedroom. A few minutes later, Nicholas, his mother, and his wife went to the police station to answer the detectives' questions. It was then that Nicholas recounted how he had learned about the incident. After Nicholas informed investigators that he had not been in the city for about a month, he handed over his cell phone. During their examination of the device, the officers discovered an app that allowed remote access to the family home's alarm system. When questioned about this, Corey explained that the alarm access was shared among all family members, but noted that it hadn't been activated that night. However, a review of the system's history revealed that the alarm had been deactivated at the exact time the intruders broke in, raising suspicions. Jacqueline corroborated her husband's story, stating that they had stayed home that night. Following these initial statements, all three were informed that they would undergo gunshot residue tests. Jacqueline's sudden nervousness caught the attention of the investigators, sparking further doubts. Meanwhile, at the crime scene, evidence collection continued, and due to the case's complexity, the district attorney was brought in to assist. She quickly began to suspect that Theodore might have known his attacker. As no fingerprints belonging to the family members were found, suspicions began to shift toward Corey. To make matters worse, Corey's decision to forego a funeral and her request to clean the house as soon as possible only fueled the investigators' doubts. While waiting for the case to be resolved, she closed the jewelry store and had her husband's remains cremated. On the same day, as his mother struggled to cope with her grief, Nicholas exchanged text messages with Spencer. He asked if Spencer wanted to see photos of the crime scene, boasting that the investigators had returned his phone, a clear sign in his view that he was no longer a suspect. When Corey was called in for another interview, the questioning was so intense that she began to feel as though she was no longer being treated as a victim. By then, however, she wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Her son had not been entirely ruled out as a suspect. On March 5, 2018, police officers began interviewing neighbors at Nicholas's apartment complex. This led them to the employee Nicholas had contacted via social media, who then revealed the details of his disturbing proposal. A few days later, armed with a search warrant, officers searched Nicholas and Jacqueline's apartment. They found ammunition matching the bullets recovered from the victim's body, as well as a marriage certificate exposing the secret wedding. They also seized a computer. When Corey learned of her son's secret marriage, she was at a loss for words. She reproached Nicholas for not doing things the right way, assuring him that there was no need to hide the marriage and that, had she known, she would have organized a proper wedding. As a result, Nicholas and Jacqueline moved back into the family home. Despite the mounting suspicions against him, Corey remained convinced of her son's innocence. Determined to support him, On March 10, 2018, Corey hired a group of attorneys and even handed over control of the jewelry store to Nicholas. Over the next month and into the following, the evidence against Nicholas began to pile up at an alarming rate. First, phone records revealed that, contrary to his initial statement, Nicholas had been in the city 2 days before the incident that claimed his father's life. Then, more incriminating text messages exchanged between him and Jacqueline surfaced. In May 2018, after locating Spencer, the detectives interviewed him at the station. Without much pressure, Spencer disclosed the amount Nicholas expected to inherit by eliminating his parents. He also provided text messages to support his claims, which cleared him of any suspicion. By the end of that month, Nicholas and Jacqueline were arrested. Both were charged with criminal solicitation to commit capital murder. Nicholas's bail was set at $3 million and Jacqueline's at $1 million. Faced with sworn statements and overwhelming evidence, Corey finally grasped the full extent of the nightmare she was living. Meanwhile, authorities hoped that time behind bars would lead the suspects to reveal the name of the actual killer. However, as neither showed any signs of cooperation, the officers prepared to take further action. During the first week of July 2018, one of the detectives meticulously reviewed the security camera footage from Nicholas and Jacqueline's home, focusing specifically on the days leading up to the crime. To his surprise, he discovered an image of Nicholas greeting 2 men at the front door. One of the men was wearing a shirt with the logo of a local company. Following this lead, the detective visited the company and learned that the man was Cameron, whose address he quickly obtained. A couple of hours later, when the detective arrived at Cameron's residence, his wife immediately knew the reason for the visit. Although Cameron wasn't home at the time, she shared what she knew and provided Johnny's name to the detective. On Wednesday, July 11, 2018, when Johnny was brought in for questioning at the station, he offered little resistance. It quickly became apparent to the detectives that they had found the accomplice they were looking for. Johnny was arrested and charged with capital murder. Further investigation revealed incriminating text messages exchanged between Johnny and Arian just hours before the crime, indicating that Johnny had not acted alone. Finding Arian, however, proved challenging, but he was finally apprehended on December 10, 2018. During his interrogation, Arian detailed the events of that night, breaking down as the questions continued. He expressed remorse for the tragedy his actions had caused and eventually admitted to being the one who fired the shot that killed Theodore. He also directed the detectives to where they could find the missing weapon, which turned out to be one of Nicholas's guns. Jacqueline, meanwhile, admitted that she had been aware of her husband's intentions from the start. Her cooperation earned her a reduced bail. With all the pieces in place for a trial, the district attorney initially planned to seek the death penalty for Nicholas. However, in the spring of 2021, the district attorney left her position, and her successor quickly offered plea deals to the 3 defendants. The deal allowed them to plead guilty to a reduced charge of murder in exchange for a 35-year sentence with the possibility of parole. In the end, all 3 accepted the offer. Jacqueline, who by that time was divorced, also agreed to plead guilty to attempted solicitation of capital murder, hoping for a more lenient sentence. In a virtual hearing held on April 7, 2021, the judge sentenced Nicholas and Arian to 35 years in prison. A week later, Johnny Leon received an identical sentence for the same crime. On June 20, 2023, Jacqueline was sentenced to 4 months in jail, 10 years of probation, and 300 hours of community service. Additionally, her passport was revoked, and she was prohibited from leaving the state of Texas without first informing her probation officers. As part of her sentence, The court ordered that Jacqueline serve 2 days in jail every year on the anniversary of Theodore's death. Corey, unable to attend the hearing, recorded a message that was played in court at the end of the session as her victim impact statement. In later interviews, Corey reflected on how Nicholas and Jacqueline had shattered a part of her world, taking away what she loved most. With remarkable strength, she set out to overcome the cruel loss of her husband and the devastating betrayal by her son, with whom she never spoke again. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations. By mid-2009, after 7 years of marriage, Lucy Landry began an affair with Gareth Jenkins, an old school friend she reconnected with on Facebook. She was tired of the 24-year age difference with her husband and his controlling nature, which had left her increasingly lonely and disillusioned. She asked her husband for a divorce and demanded that he, who was suffering from prostate cancer, pay £6,000 for a new flat for her and Mr. Jenkins to move into. The pair started to row constantly over money. On February 1st, in the presence of a neighbor, Lucy taunted her husband about naked photographs he had taken of himself 3 months previously, which she had found on his computer, calling him a pervert and taunting him that he should be on the sex offenders register. That night, they argued violently, following each other around the house, shouting and taunting each other over money, possessions, and Mr. Jenkins. The fight ended in a way that no one expected. Lucy Davies was born in 1971 in the county of Rhondda, England. She was the daughter of Roger and Andrea Davies, who were also the proud parents of another girl named Anna. The family was settled in a small community mainly formed by socially purposed housing. There, against the backdrop of beautiful mountain scenery, Lucy had a particularly happy childhood. Since she and her little sister had similar tastes, they were always very close. Her parents always highlighted Lucy's infectious joy as a standout quality. During her time in primary school, Lucy was known for her outgoing and likable temperament, which immediately endeared her to teachers and classmates alike. In addition to her charming personality, she was also recognized for her undeniable beauty, making her one of the most popular and admired girls at school. Regarding interests outside of academics, both she and Anna loved ponies. Knowing this, their father pleasantly surprised them by enrolling both in the local riding club. This sporting activity taught them discipline and also showcased their talent. Consequently, they earned the right to participate and represent the club in countless events and competitions. Thus, by the start of secondary school, Lucy shone as an exceptional rider. However, her energy and passion were not limited to the tracks, as the versatile young lady began to take flute and piano lessons, dedicating long hours to practice to master both instruments. Her efforts soon paid off, and by the following year, Lucy had a very comprehensive and detailed mastery of the wide field of classical music. Thanks to this, she was accepted into a youth orchestra and also joined her school's choir group. As often happens in this stage of adolescence, a healthy romantic interest appeared in her life, and Lucy became very close to Gareth Jenkins. However, she preferred to keep it a secret. In 1989, after finishing secondary school, Lucy was determined to pursue a career in the musical world. With that goal in mind, she enrolled to undertake a bachelor's degree at the University of Warwick. There, she began her new and promising life, always with the aspiration of becoming a teacher and dedicating herself to musical education. But things did not go as she had expected. While her passion remained, she did not enjoy the direction of the degree program. Consequently, she decided to switch her original plan and opted to study urban planning. It was around this time that she met Graham McAllister. They both discovered quite soon that their outlook on life was very similar. Aside from their love for art and shared interests, a crucial detail in their bond was the extravagant sense of humor that complemented each other. Their relationship flowed naturally, and as they made plans for the future, Lucy decided to introduce him to her parents. For Roger and Andrea, the meeting was wonderful, as they were certain that Graham was the right one for their daughter. So much so that they decided to buy Lucy a house in the city of Coventry, northwest of London. This gesture, in addition to ensuring her a life free from the upheavals of rent and moving, carried their wish for her to start a family. Shortly after moving in, Lucy invited her boyfriend to share the new home. As they continued with their studies in 1995, the young couple welcomed their first child, whom they named James. Lucy decided it was best to take a break from university to care for him. Meanwhile, Graham continued with his university commitments and, to support the household expenses, got a job working the night shift at the city's postal sorting office. Over the months, this dynamic began to affect Lucy, because alone at home, dedicated exclusively to the child, and with many hours away from her partner, a feeling of boredom took hold of her. Then, she found no better solution than to explore internet chat rooms for distraction. In this universe, she sought to meet new people. One night, while Lucy was immersed in lively conversations in various chat rooms, she came into contact with Harold Landry. At 53 years old and of American origin, Harold came from a financially struggling family in Louisiana. However, he understood early on that, being just one among a dozen siblings, he would have to achieve everything through his own effort and will. Thus, from a young age, he dedicated himself to hard work to escape poverty. His opportunity arrived when he realized that in the oil business, the key was not in owning a well, but in providing the essential infrastructure for the owners of such fields. Consequently, he founded his own company, focused exclusively on the design and manufacture of hydraulic equipment for major oil companies in the southern United States. As he had anticipated, the business allowed him to amass a great fortune, eventually reaching billionaire status. By that time, he divided his time between his eccentric hobbies and a property on the island of Cozumel in Mexico. On a personal level, he had been married and divorced twice. From these unions, he had children whose exact number and identities are not publicly known. What was known, however, was that Harold made sure they lacked nothing. A particularly relevant event occurred in 1992 when, being single again, he met a married woman 20 years his junior. However, neither her family nor her husband were obstacles for Harold, who directed all his seductive strategy towards her and won her over. On February 6, 1994, Harold picked her up to take her for a ride in New Orleans. For this occasion, they hired a babysitter. After concluding the evening, Harold accompanied his lover back to her home and offered to take the babysitter back to hers. No one seemed concerned about the fact that the husband would find out about the betrayal and could act as a wounded man. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Outside the residence, the betrayed husband was monitoring every move of his wife. Once the third party said goodbye, he followed him in his car. A few minutes later, Harold finally noticed the vehicle tailing him. Then, almost as an instinctive gesture, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the firearm he usually kept. When both stopped at a red light, things spiraled out of control, as the babysitter later narrated. Harold then brandished a revolver at the betrayed husband and fired. The bullet severed an artery in his neck and damaged a nerve leading to a vocal cord. The husband, called Chris Price, collapsed on the pavement with a wound on his neck, but fortunately there was a hospital right in front of them, which allowed him to receive immediate aid, and the doctors were able to save his life. As for Harold, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The trial against him took place in 1997. In his opening statement, the defense attorney told the jury that Chris had only been the victim of a tragic and sordid affair. Regarding his client, he mentioned that he acted out of fear and in self-defense. The defense's clever strategy led the jury, consisting of 4 men and 8 women, to find Harold guilty of the lesser charge of aggravated assault. As a result, he was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. After appealing, Harold obtained probation. In exchange, he had to pay a fine of $500 and fulfill community service obligations. Although he sought to be completely exonerated, he thanked Pat for his hard work. Since then, they became great friends. Shortly after, Harold and Chris agreed on an undisclosed settlement amount. By the time Harold began talking with Lucy, he was residing in Covington and was still wealthy enough not to have to work. He was also honest about his occupations and everything related to his past life, including love affairs and legal details. But all these elements only served to increase Lucy's attraction to him. What followed was an engaging online romance, with Harold promising her a more than tempting lifestyle. His persistence and persuasive power bore fruit when Lucy finally asked Graham to end their relationship. Thus, he had the path clear, without a rival that could cause him trouble, as had happened with Chris. With the wind in his favor in the early 2000s, Harold traveled to England to meet her, and she took the opportunity to introduce him to her parents as her boyfriend. Although Roger and Andrea were surprised by the significant age difference, they respected their daughter's decisions and did not object to the relationship. Feeling fulfilled and fortunate to share his life with her, Harold spared no effort to surprise her, whether with luxurious gifts or anything else Lucy desired. In fact, by then, he was so in love that he was already planning to propose marriage. However, he didn't want it to be just any proposal. He wished to do it in an ideal setting. To achieve this goal, he took her, along with her son James, and included Graham in the group on a trip. The chosen destination was Mexico, which for Harold was by then his favorite place in the world. Additionally, his longtime friend Pat, who had been his attorney in the past trial, also had an apartment close to his residence, which added to the feeling of comfort. Initially, Harold bought a diamond ring and shared the news with enthusiasm with Pat. Nonetheless, his friend harbored certain suspicions about his future fiancée. Moreover, over the days, Pat found it strange that Lucy had dedicated a good part of her time in the company of Graham. He seemed to be completely blind to it, and ultimately, he proceeded with his plan to propose. Lucy happily accepted the proposal, and in mid-2003, the couple celebrated their union. Shortly afterward, Harold surprised her by acquiring a $1 million property in an exclusive neighborhood in Worcestershire. In this rural setting, the marriage had a prosperous and peaceful start, further favored by the presence of excellent neighbors like Rachel Clark and Stephen Kennedy, with whom Harold and Lucy formed a lovely friendship. Soon, the newlyweds had their first daughter, whom they named Harriet. The event filled both Lucy and Harold with joy, and from then on, he dedicated himself to the little girl with undiminished energy and commitment. Equally important and affectionate was the relationship he maintained with James, whom he treated as if he were his own son. But relentless time began to erode their initial bliss. Gradually, the demands made towards Lucy increased, and her moodiness became directly proportional to her husband's demands. As he saw it, his wife was to constantly adjust to his preferences and adopt a submissive role to his requests. She, on the other hand, had different expectations, so tensions quickly became apparent. As a conclusion, Lucy was direct and unafraid to express her thoughts, and in this dynamic, her husband was not willing to yield. With both having volatile personalities, their arguments often culminated in explosive breakups, followed by reconciliation once the storm had passed. Thus, moments that had once been pleasurable, like the children's vacations, became increasingly marred by fights. Meanwhile, James witnessed the disintegration of his mother and stepfather's relationship. To their neighbors' dismay, the disputes that stretched on for hours became a sort of regular soundtrack. By that time, Rachel and Stephen were aware that the couple had a tendency to abuse alcohol, knowing well that this was the fuel that ignited their shouting and complaints. When Lucy and Harold unleashed all their anger, leading to prolonged periods of not speaking to each other, their neighbors felt peace return. In mid-2009, thanks to social media, Lucy reconnected with Gareth. Having had no contact since their platonic love in secondary school, they caught up and chatted for hours, with necessary interruptions due to both of their commitments. After Harold went to sleep, his wife stayed in front of the screen. Soon, it became evident to him that, feeling unhappy, his wife had resorted to the same escape route through which she had found him, and he had no doubt she was looking for a replacement. However, far from confronting her, he considered giving her some space and traveled to Mexico, where he stayed for a while. Meanwhile, Lucy took the opportunity to invite Gareth to stay with her. In the autumn of 2009, her husband returned to England, thinking this time would resolve their marriage. But as soon as he stepped into the house, Lucy asked him for a divorce. Initially, he felt devastated. Then, after a few weeks, Harold began a relationship. He met this new woman online. She lived in the vicinity and went by the name of Rachel. Parallel to each of their new romances, the divorce negotiations were underway, and as often happens, new conflicts emerged. Especially concerning the house, Lucy expected to keep it to ensure a roof over her children's heads. For Harold, on the other hand, this matter was non-negotiable. His solution was to offer her money to buy herself a more modest apartment on her own. At the same time, he completely excluded her from his will. Upon learning of the decisions of her still husband, Lucy flew into a rage. Her feelings of hatred towards him made her share everything about Harold's past with her son James, not leaving anything out. Amidst the complicated process and considering the evident tension she was living in, Gareth invited her to spend a few days with him in Wales. Upon her return to familiar surroundings, Lucy no longer wished to disguise or hide her lengthy phone conversations with her new love. Meanwhile, both she and Harold were immersed in excessive alcohol consumption. The arguments escalated to unexpected heights, leaving the children at the mercy of a violent and unbearable atmosphere. On the afternoon of Monday, February 1st, 2010, Harold drank several glasses of wine. At one point, he received a package intended for Stephen. Around 9 o'clock at night, when Stephen returned from work, he found a postal notification indicating that his parcel had been delivered to his neighbor. The Landry's lights were on, so he went there. Harold invited him in and served him a glass of wine. After greeting Lucy and exchanging a few words, Stephen noticed how drunk his host was. He took his package, excused himself, and left. Subsequently, the couple engaged in a nonsensical argument, specifically over a furniture purchase she was planning for their move. James acted as the years of fights had taught him. This time, the disagreement escalated to a physical altercation. In the scuffle, Harold grabbed a kitchen utensil with which he struck Lucy on the cheek. Unable to continue avoiding the facts, James appeared at the scene of the dispute and found his mother injured. He immediately called the police and then focused on securing his younger sister's safety. Not long after, Lucy and her children left the house seeking help. The first place she thought to go was to Stephen's house. However, just as she headed in that direction, Harold caught up to her and, with a knife, caused her multiple injuries. Then he left her under a bush in the garden and walked away. Alerted by the screams, Stephen went outside. It only took him a few steps to discover his neighbor. Although he initially thought she was unconscious, he quickly understood the severity of the situation. At that moment, responding to the emergency call, the police arrived at the scene. They called the paramedics and searched the vicinity for the perpetrator. However, they only found the children, hidden and terrified in the backyard amidst the darkness. Once on site, the paramedics acted as quickly as possible, and Lucy was transported to the hospital. Very shortly after, her heart stopped. Meanwhile, Harold went to Rachel's house and confessed that something terrible had happened, but without giving further details. He then gave her 3 bank drafts totaling $40,000, a sum of cash, the keys to his car, and several signed blank checks. Then he set off back home. By that time, several police patrols were trying to locate him. Eventually, they found him walking along the road and proceeded to arrest him. Roger and Andrea were overwhelmed with despair upon hearing the tragic news. In a statement shared by the police, they asked for respect during their time of unimaginable sorrow from losing their daughter. For now, they had nothing more to say to the media. From then on, all their attention was focused on looking after their grandchildren. The forensic examination confirmed that Lucy had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the chest. With this evidence and having James as a first-hand witness, on February 5, 2010, Harold appeared before the court and was charged with murder. The trial took place in early February 2011. It was presided over by Judge David Foskett. On this occasion, Pat was not the defender of his friend. That task fell to attorney Andy Childs. Despite the evident difficulty of his task, the defense attorney argued that his client had been provoked by the fury of his wife, who left him no alternative but to act as he did. During his initial statements from the stand, Harold, amidst sobs, stated that he loved Lucy and regretted his actions. He then adhered to the strategy laid out by his lawyer, admitting to involuntary manslaughter because, in his words, Lucy had pushed him to the limit. To highlight the violence of the case, the prosecution presented a very detailed animation of the multiple injuries suffered by the victim. This presentation was shocking to those present in the courtroom. Finally, on February 24, 2011, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harold Landry guilty of the murder of his wife, Lucy Landry, who was 38 years old at the time of her death, while Harold was 64. The following day was for the judge to impose the sentence. He had harsh words for Harold, whose attack he described as indescribable and unforgivable. He also dismissed Harold's claims of possible provocation by Lucy, considering them a vain attempt by the defendant to save himself. Consequently, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole. By that time, however, he would be over 80 years old. Lucy's loved ones thanked not only for the resolution, but also for the judge's remarks, which they felt almost perfectly expressed what they themselves felt. They noted that the sentence somehow helped alleviate the pain of their loss, although they also admitted that no number of years in prison for Harold would bring back Lucy's life, so they would have to work on accepting this painful reality. For his part, Harold insisted on proclaiming his innocence, as he was heard saying he hoped to be able to appeal the sentence in the future. And that's the case for today. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. See you soon. On November 15, 2013, Chris called 911. He said he had arrived home and found his parents unresponsive in their truck. Chris said that Roger was coughing and that Melissa's head was bobbing up and down. He said they were alive but barely moving. The dispatcher asked Chris to put them on their backs to try to administer CPR. Roger and Melissa had both been shot in the right side of their heads. Melissa Blumel died the next day, and Roger Blumel died about 5 weeks later. Roger Blumel was born on January 17, 1965, into a household bustling with many members, including his parents and 7 children, 6 boys and a girl. Roger's family was not only large but also very united, raised with a strong sense of values and community life. Even while still in high school, Roger proved to be a hard-working young man with goals for the future. He began driving his father's truck and, after graduating from the local high school, worked in concrete transportation. Later, he discovered that his true calling was in sales, a field in which he eventually found success. According to his friends, he was one of those people capable of selling ice to Eskimos. This skill was also accompanied by a generous, cheerful, and extroverted personality. He always seemed happy, and nothing pleased him more than making everyone around him have a big smile on their faces. Roger had a good life and an excellent relationship with his family. The only thing missing was a partner, and one day he achieved that too. The details are not specified, but a close friend later recounted that at the end of the evening, when he met a young woman who captivated him, Roger declared with absolute resolution that she was the woman he was going to marry. The girl in question was named Melissa. She was born in Wichita on January 1, 1960. Her childhood, too, was spent in a loving family comprised of 3 girls and 3 boys, though a younger sister died before reaching her first birthday. Melissa was a sweet, hard-working girl, always ready to help not just her family but everyone around her. She began working as a cashier at a bank where she made a successful career. In the following years, her seriousness, commitment, and sense of collaboration earned her several promotions that led her to become the vice president of the bank. That first meeting marked the beginning of the union of 2 soulmates who married in 1991. Life for the Blumels seemed perfect as Melissa climbed the ranks within the bank, and Roger's charm led him to establish his own business. Roger loved to share time with friends and bring joy to everyone around him. In Melissa, he found the perfect companion. Moreover, both had a strong social consciousness that led them to collaborate and participate in any charitable, sports, or collective activity that took place in their community. However, as we've seen in almost all stories, a perfect life does not exist, and for the Blumels, the only thing missing was a child to bring laughter and joy to their loving home. Unfortunately, this desire remained elusive for the couple, and after years of unsuccessfully trying to conceive, Roger and Melissa began to consider the idea of adopting a child. With this intention, they contacted a local social worker. Their wishes were heard, and doubly so, as a woman named Keisha Schaberg had put up her 2 sons for adoption. Anthony, 7 years old, whom everyone called Tony, and Christopher, 4 years old, known as Chris. Keisha's idea was to place them in an open adoption so she could maintain contact with her sons and the family raising them. However, the Blumels did not consider this the best option, as they wanted to raise the children as their own and completely remove them from what had been a tough start in life. In the end, Roger and Melissa's approach prevailed, and from that moment, Tony and Chris formally became part of the Blumel family, starting to enjoy a life they never knew existed. In fact, it was later known that Tony was amazed he was allowed to have dinner every day. The children quickly adapted and began to enjoy their new life. They attended elementary school and successfully completed that stage as good students. In high school, they were also successful, had no problems with their peers, were fully integrated and made a wide group of friends, and excelled in sports, particularly in wrestling and football. Tony made rapid progress in wrestling, securing second place in a competition in his division. At that time, everything seemed to promise a bright future for the boys and a happy life for the whole family. But the Blumels' world began to turn upside down when Tony reached his senior year of high school. The young man began to change what had until then been exemplary behavior. He turned into someone who was constantly in conflict with his parents, accusing them of always favoring his younger brother Chris. From then on, he engaged in alcohol consumption, disregarded curfews, and even smoked marijuana. Things in the Blumel household became chaotic, and soon it seemed that the last hope for the young man to correct his path was lost. For a long time, Tony had expressed a fervent desire to join the United States Air Force after finishing high school. But this dream dissipated due to his own behavior when, in 2013, he was arrested for an unspecified act of aggression, and shortly after graduating, again for driving under the influence of alcohol. With these records, he could say goodbye to a future in military aviation. These events did not lead Tony to reflect. On the contrary, it plunged him into a downward spiral. Once he graduated from high school, his life had no direction. He did not want to continue studying, nor did he want to work. In fact, he wanted to do nothing more than sleep late and spend the rest of his day immersed in a cloud of cannabis smoke. Melissa lived in terror of the boy's outbursts of rage. And amidst all this situation, which was so difficult to bear, there was something else that the Blumels did not know. Since the spring of 2013, through social media, Keisha had been contacting her biological sons. While it seems Chris either rejected Keisha's friend request or was not very receptive to communicating with his biological mother, Tony not only accepted immediately, but was also completely excited to reconnect with his real mother. Keisha had been devastated after giving her sons to the Blumels. Although she was relieved to know that both had been welcomed into the same good family and would stay together, she could not resign herself to the lack of contact. Reconnecting with her eldest son filled Keisha with excitement, but at the same time she developed a great resentment towards the Blumels, believing that they had turned Chris against her. However, this feeling was undoubtedly overshadowed by the happiness of reconnecting with her firstborn. Additionally, the news of Tony's problems with his adoptive parents fueled Keisha's hope of reuniting with her son, and she wasted no time in offering him to come to see her. Meanwhile, at the adoptive family's home, far from improving, things were getting worse. The conflict reached a point of no return when one day, in the midst of one of his fits of rage, Tony punched a hole in a wall. This was the turning point for the Blumels. They could no longer risk their own safety and that of Chris. After several unsuccessful discussions trying to put an end to the eldest son's behaviors, Roger and Melissa came to the difficult decision to tell Tony that he had to leave the house. The young man initially wandered aimlessly but soon realized He had to do something to sustain himself, so he got some jobs at fast food restaurants and supplemented those meager earnings by selling cannabis. Although he slept like a nomad from night to night at some friends' houses, he ended up associating with a group of youths who were deeply involved in excessive drug use. And amid all these despairing events, a lifeline suddenly appeared for Tony when Keisha told him to come to California to live with her. Tony eagerly accepted the invitation, and the reunion took place in September 2013 at Keisha's house in California. The young man was accompanied by his best friend from high school, Braden, who had dropped out in his junior year to dedicate himself to drug dealing. The two young men were excited because they arrived with the hope of having Keisha's support, who was also versed in the drug trade, to start a large marijuana business in the area, and they even talked about entering the medical cannabis market. The reality was that the two young men had arrived to live in a small apartment which had only one room. It is not hard to imagine that the situation in the place began to be tense, particularly because Sean, Keisha's partner, had 2 jobs and was the only one bringing in money to cover the expenses for 5 people. Keisha only contributed a part of the social assistance she received for her daughter. Keisha, Tony, and Braden spent their days using drugs, and the woman's younger daughter was all the time under that bad influence. Logically, at one point things reached an unacceptable limit, something that happened when Sean found out that Tony and Braden were selling marijuana near her house. She let them know that what they were doing was simply unacceptable and dangerous for her as the property owner. Consequently, she told them to take their drugs elsewhere. Additionally, after this episode, Sean gave an ultimatum to the house occupants. Everyone had to get a job or leave the apartment. Far from making the group reflect, as was her intention, what it achieved was that they formed an alliance to show indignation towards her. They decided to leave the apartment and go to a nearby hotel for 2 weeks. But that was not the solution either, because without having an income, after those weeks they had no means to sustain the hotel payment. The need for money did not make them consider working decently. The first idea they had was to return to Kansas, perhaps because it was familiar territory for Tony in terms of drug dealing. After almost a day on the road, the group decided to stop in Arizona and spend the night at a hotel. It was there that Tony told his travel companions that he had come up with an idea, which was to end the lives of his adoptive parents to claim the inheritance. Once they arrived in Wichita and found accommodation at a hotel they rented for a month, they dedicated themselves to refining the details of that idea. It was a simple solution. They had to end the lives of Roger and Melissa, claim the insurance, sell the assets, and use the resources to start a new, larger-scale drug business. Tony was convinced that the original family, which he had returned to, would become rich by cultivating and selling marijuana. Tony even proposed a perfect day to carry out the crime. It would be Friday, November 15th of that year, 2013, as his brother Chris would not be at home, as he had to attend an event related to his wrestling practice. Tony had been a star in that discipline and still maintained contact with some team members, which is how he learned about his brother's commitment that night. Gradually, the plan was formed, in which Tony would communicate with Roger and Melissa and invite them somewhere with the excuse of talking about what had happened between them and try to fix things. Tony's idea was that, while there was no one at home, Braden would take Keisha to the residence so she could enter and steal some valuables. Tony also knew where his adoptive parents kept a significant amount of money for emergencies. The idea was that the act would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But from the beginning, the final intention was clear. When Roger and Melissa returned home, Keisha would end their lives. Everyone thought it was an excellent plan, but later, Braden backed out. He did not want to participate in the act, but agreed to help by acquiring the guns they would need. As a substitute, he recommended a friend of his, also a former high school peer named Andrew, who could take on the role as the driver to take Keisha to the Blumels' residence. As promised, Braden procured 2 pistols purchased from other criminals. It should be mentioned that there was never any intention to share the money with Andrew, who was agreed to be paid $1,000 to act essentially as a driver and support for Keisha in the robbery. In the end, she would be the executor. In early November, Keisha posted on her social networks a photo of her with Tony and a caption that read, "A bond that cannot be broken." Finally, the day arrived. It was Friday, November 15th, 2013, and as Tony had predicted, his wonderful adoptive parents did not refuse to meet with him. The meeting went peacefully. While at the Blumels' house, the scene was completely different. As soon as Roger and Melissa left for the meeting, Keisha and Andrew entered the house, forced the garage door, and began to rummage through everything. They took the opportunity to take some small, valuable items and the cash the couple kept in the house for any eventuality. Once the first part of the plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew hid beside the secluded residence to wait for their victims to arrive. They soon received a call from Tony, informing them that the meeting had ended, that his adoptive parents had dropped him off at the hotel, and they were on their way home. The wait was not too long. As soon as the Blumels' vehicle stopped in front of the parking gate, the 2 attackers came out of their hiding place. Keisha immediately positioned herself on Melissa's side, while Andrew aimed at Roger to keep him still. Melissa, still surprised, recognized the mother of the children they had adopted more than 10 years ago to provide love, stability, and a better future. She only managed to say, "Oh my God, Keisha," when a precise shot to the head made her collapse in the seat. Roger, completely disconcerted, tried to assist his wife. Meanwhile, Keisha reached the man's window and pulled the trigger towards Roger's head, but the gun jammed. The woman made several attempts to shoot while he was frozen, with the slumped body of his wife next to him. Finally, the gun fired, and Roger also collapsed next to the one who had been the best partner for his life project. Once the fatal plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew boarded the vehicle they had arrived in and quickly left. The Blumel spouses remained there until around 9:15 p.m., when Chris returned from his meeting and found the terrible scene. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had just arrived home and found his parents practically unconscious inside their van. The young man stated that Roger was coughing and that Melissa was bobbing her head up and down. Both had gunshot marks on their heads. The dispatcher instructed him to try resuscitation maneuvers while emergency services arrived a few minutes later and took over the situation. Miraculously, the Blumels were still alive, but their lives were hanging by a thread, so they were immediately transported to a hospital. While all this was happening, upon returning to the hotel where they were staying, Keisha seemed to have a panic attack and stated that all she needed was to consume some illicit substance, and she did so accompanied by the other boys. Also, at that moment, Keisha handed over the used gun and a wallet of Melissa's that she had stolen from the house to be disposed of in a nearby stream. Andrew threw the items into the pond of a nearby park. The following day, Tony began using the money stolen from his adoptive parents' home to start trafficking marijuana, earning his first $100. Unfortunately, that same day, Melissa lost her battle and passed away at the age of 53. Tony also went to the hospital to see his father, but what he did not know is that sometime before, he had been removed from both the Blumels' will and their insurance policies. Consequently, the 2 heinous crimes had been committed in vain. In the following days, it was also discovered that Andrew had not been paid, and was even unaware that Keisha had taken cash from the Blumel family's home. Eventually, fate caught up with them. In the initial inspections of the Blumel residence, the police noticed that the garage door had been forced open, and inside the home everything was in disarray. There were items scattered everywhere. It was confirmed that money, jewelry, and other items had been stolen. The authorities wondered if the attack on the spouses had been a result of them arriving while the thieves were still in the house. However, the fatal assault had occurred before the couple entered the home, so this initial hypothesis was dismissed. In the van where Roger and Melissa were attacked, there were no significant fingerprints, although investigators did find a bullet casing. Then, the authorities turned their attention towards the victims' workplaces, thinking perhaps an upset client had sought revenge. But this theory was also discarded, so it was time to talk to people close to the couple. The first on the detectives' list was Tony, as he had been the last person seen alive with the victims. But the young man insisted he knew nothing and had not participated in the act. According to him, after finishing dinner, he had gone straight back to the hotel where he was staying with his mother. This information was confirmed by the staff at the tolls. The second on the list was Chris, who had found the bodies, but he was quickly dismissed after verifying his statement that at the time of the incident, he was at a dinner with members of the wrestling team. However, the investigators found something strange in the young man's behavior. He didn't seem overly disturbed and instead appeared to be lost in thought. When the police pursued this direction and asked him what he thought had happened to his parents, Chris immediately replied that there was only one person who came to mind. He added that the only one who might hold any grudge against their parents and perhaps be capable of such an act was his older brother, Tony. With this significant lead, the authorities got a lucky break in their search for the culprits. A man contacted the police to say that a young man who was a friend of Tony had approached him intending to buy a gun. The detectives focused on this individual, and upon checking his background, found he had a long history related to drugs. Moreover, they discovered he had traveled to California along with Tony. It was Braden. Sooner rather than later, Braden received a message from his family informing him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking to interrogate him about what had happened to the Blumels. The morning after receiving this information, Braden went to the police station. A press report states that on his way to the police station, he stopped by a pond to throw away something, apparently the guns used in the crime, which had not been disposed of as planned. According to this account, he was already under surveillance, and when the police searched the water, they found in the bag he threw a pistol that had not been fired in the attack. Braden's interrogation lasted for 3 days. At first, the young man maintained he had nothing to do with the incident, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from the authorities and ended up confessing everything he knew, stating that the idea for the attack had been Tony's. Tony Blumel, 18 years old, and his biological mother, Keisha, 35, were arrested on November 19th at the hotel where they were staying. Additionally, Andrew, then 18 years old, was arrested. And finally, Braden, also 18, was put behind bars on November 20th of that same year, 2013. At that time, Keisha did not admit her participation in the robbery and other crimes, although the 3 young men confessed what had happened. On November 25, 2013, the accused made their first appearance before the court via video conference. On that occasion, they were all charged with the same offenses: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, burglary, and theft. The 3 young men were set a bail of $500,000, and for Keisha, the bail was set at $1 million. On December 21st, Roger's heart stopped beating, and at 48 years old, he joined his beloved Melissa. And after Roger's death, the situation for the woman and the three young men worsened, as they could be charged with capital murder, which could imply a death penalty sentence. Indeed, on January 3, 2014, the four detainees were formally charged with a count of capital murder for being the alleged perpetrators of the death of more than one person in the same incident. Additionally, Keisha was charged with 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of theft. The preliminary hearing took place on July 17th of that same year. By that time, Braden had negotiated with the authorities, and in exchange for a benefit in his sentence, he ended up becoming the prosecution's star witness. After a year of negotiations, not only did Braden reach an agreement, but 2 other individuals involved in the crime also negotiated with the prosecution. According to the agreements reached, the accused would not dispute the charges against them and would waive their right to appeal their sentences. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop some charges. Starting in mid-2015, in separate hearings, each confirmed their decision to plead guilty. The judge sentenced Keisha to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, and additionally to 122 months in prison for 2 counts of aggravated robbery. The sentences would be served consecutively. In her opportunity to speak, she stated she deeply regretted what had happened and lamented everything the Blumel family had to go through. The rest of her statement was controversial, as she claimed she had nothing to do with the incident, having no anger towards the Blumels. On the contrary, she had the utmost respect for them, as they had given Tony and Chris a wonderful life, and she would always be grateful for that. According to official records to this day, Keisha remains detained in a high-security level correctional facility. The second to face his fate was her son, Anthony Blumel, known to everyone as Tony, who received the same sentence as his mother. During the sentencing hearing, Tony, who declined to speak when given the opportunity, heard the victim impact statement made by his aunt, Christina Blumel, who thanked the authorities for administering justice and referred to all the love that Roger and Melissa had given the boy. In complete silence, Tony listened to Christina's heartfelt words, and at one moment, tears almost sprang from the young criminal's eyes. In the end, the woman told Tony that he had chosen his path without anyone forcing him to make those decisions. She added that perhaps one day he might understand his choices, or perhaps he never would. Tony has been since then in a correctional facility. His record up to this moment listed a significant number of prison infractions related to smuggling, fights, unauthorized phone use, explicit sex, theft, and disobedience, among others. A week after these sentences, it was Andrew's turn, the only one who did not agree to acknowledge his responsibility and was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus 155 months. Finally, Braden, the last of the participants in the incident and who from the beginning had reached an agreement with the prosecution, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. According to his official record, his first opportunity for release will be on May 28, 2035. However, his prison record shows that far from reforming, Braden had received 71 disciplinary reports for disobedience, threats to others, stimulant use, intoxication, possession of tobacco contraband, theft, and dangerous smuggling, among other causes. In the end, the district attorney expressed satisfaction with the outcome of this case. It's worth noting that even though she had waived that right, Keisha attempted to appeal her sentences unsuccessfully. At the end of this story, only one thing remains undisputed. The lives of 2 wonderful people, Roger and Melissa Blumel, were cut short with a terrible and unnecessary ending. The bitterness, or perhaps the guilt of a woman who led a life of excess for which she gave up her children for adoption, was the genesis of the tragedy. She couldn't bear that one of her descendants wanted nothing more to do with her, which apparently led her to direct her anger at the people who gave all their love and well-being to her children. For his part, Tony repaid all the love and care received from that couple with resentment, envy, and violence, resorting to an unjustifiable path of substance abuse, and finally, a double crime. Keisha's younger daughter ended up being sent to a foster home. As for Chris Blumel, he managed to overcome what happened and has led a good life with the support of the family. And well, dear audience, that concludes today's case. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another episode of Unreal True Crime. Goodbye. Traveling through a trail for 2 hours, the police reached the location. Arcadio Alvarez was found in a sugarcane field. It was at that moment that they apprehended the suspect, who was accused of committing incest for about 30 years against his eldest daughter, Alba Nidia, with whom he had at least 14 children, of which 8 survived. Very little is known about the childhood and youth of Arcadio Alvarez. We know that at some point during his youth, he formed a relationship with a woman whose identity has not been disclosed, and with whom he had a daughter. It appears that his partner died in 1979, and he was left to care for the little girl, who was then 5 years old. The girl's name was Alba Nidia Alvarez, who later became known as Nidia. After the death of his life partner, Arcadio moved into the home of a relative, an aunt of Nidia's, though it was unclear whether she was his sister or the sister of his deceased wife. However, a few years later, Arcadio began to encounter problems in that house, which is unsurprising, as the man started to abuse his daughter. This inappropriate behavior began when she was 5 years old. When she was around 13 years old, Nidia gave birth to her first baby, a boy who was also her brother. For her, this situation was always a tragedy, but her father was indifferent to it. They eventually settled with his family in a small village very far from everything in the south of Colombia, where only the most basic services were available. There were barely 200 families living in the area. Arcadio was a farmer with very few resources. As a result of his precarious economic situation, upon arriving at the place, he settled his family in a fragile and unstable wooden house with a zinc roof and dirt floors. It is noteworthy that by the time Arcadio arrived in that area, the family had 4 children. For the people of the region, initially, nothing seemed too strange. They simply saw the newcomers as good people, even though they were not very sociable or communicative. Nidia was a very reserved young lady and did not socialize with the local residents. In fact, she never left the house unless she was with her father, and she was essentially only seen when going out to buy supplies for the family alongside Arcadio. Some were concerned that she was school-age but did not attend the public school in the town. However, they never inquired about the reasons why the father did not send her to school. One day, reality struck everyone when it became evident that Nidia was pregnant. If she didn't leave the house, didn't have a boyfriend, and her father exercised complete control over her eldest daughter, the only possible conclusion was that the young girl, while a minor, was being abused by her father. But even though the abuse situation was clear to everyone, no one spoke. By the time Nydia was over 20 years old, she had had 11 pregnancies, not all of which came to term, and not all of the babies born survived. Nydia never gave birth in a hospital. It was often up to someone else to help her bring into the world the children fathered by Arsadio. In the small town, everyone gossiped about this. Initially, they were horrified, but nobody said anything. Of the 14 children Arsadio and his daughter Nydia had, in the end, only 8 survived, 3 girls and 5 boys. Only Nydia learned to read and write because her father taught her. The rest had all their rights violated, starting with the right to an identity, since they were never legally registered. It was as if they did not exist. Without an essential document like the birth certificate, they could never enroll in the small local school that around 80 children attended, nor were they vaccinated or treated at the local clinic. Local inhabitants later reported that they saw the irregular couple when they went out shopping and never noticed any affectionate relationship between them. Some neighbors claimed they had the chance to talk with Nydia, but instead of offering help or some kind of support to get out of the situation in which she was the victim, they blamed her. They told her that having intimacy and children with her father was not right. Her response was always to remain silent. No one ever dared to confront Arsadio or reproach his misconduct. Later, some neighbors claimed that while he seemed like a decent man, he was extremely serious, and the people feared he might do something to them. Over time, the forbidden carnal relationship between relatives became something everyone started to accept as normal in the locality. Apparently, on a few occasions, the Alvarez's home was visited by personnel from the local Secretary of Education and the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, as well as representatives of the Catholic and evangelical churches. The goal of all was to motivate the parents to send the kids to school, but this never had any effect. To make matters worse, these organizations also failed to pay attention to the fact that the children were not legally registered. It seemed that at that moment, the wind was blowing in Arsadio's favor. However, Arsadio pushed the limits too far, and that was the beginning of the end of his sinister plan of subjugation and abuse to the detriment of his entire family. As Nydia later recounted, her father began to show interest in perpetuating his deviant behavior with at least one of his granddaughters, who was around 11 years old. And as if his immoral behavior wasn't enough, he began to insinuate to his older male children that they could do the same. This undoubtedly set off alarms for Nydia, and it could be said that a divine intervention paved the way to the end. Around that time, Orlando, a pastor from the Pentecostal church, spoke to those present at one of his sermons, including Arsadio, who wanted to appear as a correct and faithful man, about the topic of incest and what it meant, labeling it as a terrible sin. This was a turning point in Nydia's life, who, at the end of the meeting, approached the pastor to ask him to pray for her. But the stars were aligning, as around that time, the world learned about the terrible case of Elisabeth Fritzl in Austria, whose father, Joseph Fritzl, kept her captive in the basement of his own house for 24 years, fathering 7 children with her. The case of Elisabeth was so shocking that it seemed people around the world were willing to prevent such situations from being repeated. It was this story that propelled Nydia to make a definitive decision. Also, religious conviction that her father was forcing her to commit a sin, and the fear that one of her daughters could become a victim of the same man added to the need to protect her descendants from the father's brutal assaults. The man, who always had a hellish temperament, beat one of his 6-year-old sons for waking him from his nap by fighting with one of his sisters. That, apparently, was the last straw. At that moment, Nydia confronted her father who, as he always had, reacted by hitting her. This was the strategy the man had used for years to ensure obedience through fear. But this time was different. Fueled by rage and courage, Nydia fought back, something that surprised Arsadio. Nydia knew she had no other option but to leave that house. For that, she not only gathered courage but also had the full support of her older daughters. Trusting in God's will and with the strength gained from her conversations with the pastor at the first opportunity, Nydia took her 6 youngest children and fled the humble house that had been her prison. The 2 oldest male children, 18 and 16 years old at that time, chose to stay with their father. The group left and headed to a nearby town, where Nydia took some time to settle her family before formally filing a complaint against her father with the authorities. Initially, she only dared to accuse him of having beaten her young son, but later she expanded the complaint to detail the years of abuse she herself had been a victim of. Clearly, before taking any action, the authorities had to conduct an investigation to corroborate the serious accusations Nydia had made. Meanwhile, her 6 children depended solely on her, and they were in a different town where rent had to be paid. But if there was something Nydia was an expert at, it was working hard, so it didn't take too long before she found a job at a local restaurant. She worked exhausting shifts, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 8 at night. She devoted 15 hours of her life daily, from Sunday to Sunday, to the demanding job that barely earned her 7,000 pesos, less than $4 at that time. In the meantime, her eldest daughter, 16 years old, took care of her siblings and became the most important support for the suffering mother. However, the authorities who heard Nydia did not make much effort to investigate what happened, and valuable time was lost for the woman and her children in terms of receiving the support they were justly entitled to from the Colombian state. The first to take real action on the complaint was a family commissioner who, seeing that the case was not being properly addressed, decided to send the information to Hugo Parra, a close collaborator of a counselor. Months had passed after the first complaint was made when Hugo, representing the counselor, arrived at the house occupied by Nydia and her children to learn firsthand what had happened. The man was completely shocked. As Hugo later told the media that covered the story, Nydia and her children were living in extreme poverty. The house they inhabited was in terrible condition, lacking clean water. The smell was almost unbearable. And of Nydia, only her shadow remained, as the 35-year-old woman looked almost 70. At that moment, it was decided to make the case public knowledge and to start a strict follow-up of the progress of the complaint. The following months were dedicated to gathering testimonies that would attest to the truthfulness of Nydia's accusations. Finally, in January 2009, it was considered that there were sufficient elements to present the case to the General Attorney of the nation. Immediately, the highest authority of the public ministry ordered a group of detectives to start investigating the facts officially and in depth. The impunity that Arsadio had enjoyed came to an end on March 27, 2009. That day, agents of the investigation team, known by its initials as CTI, initiated an operation to capture the alleged perpetrator. They had to travel 2 hours through intricate paths to reach the sugarcane plantation where Arsadio was known to be. Finally, the 58-year-old man was detained. In his initial statement to the authorities after being arrested, Arsadio maintained that he had never forced Nydia to engage in inappropriate sexual relations and also asserted that she was not his biological daughter but had been adopted. Needless to say, he also denied having intentions of abusing his daughters, much less having instigated his older sons to do so. Upon hearing her father's statements, Nydia affirmed that he used the same argument of her supposed adoption to abuse her. She added that her father subjected her to the most terrible treatments, besides having her practically imprisoned since she lived locked up and could not go anywhere unless it was with him. Among everything, perhaps the most surprising was when she claimed that he would always be her father and as such, she had to respect him. She then detailed that she always maintained in her conversations with Arsadio, when trying to reason with him, that she loved him as a father and never saw him as a man. On March 28, 2009, the trial against Arcadio Alvarez took place. There, the abuser maintained his version that Nidia was not his biological daughter but an adopted one, and stated that the two had agreed to love each other. What he could not explain was how he could have made such an agreement with a girl of 5 years old, which was the age she was when he violated her for the first time. Following this hearing, Arcadio was transferred to the local jail amidst a crowd gathered at the courthouse gates to shout insults at the abuser. The police had to act quickly to remove him from the place, as many in the crowd wanted to physically assault him. The detainee was charged with sexual abuse, violent carnal access, and incest against his daughter Alba Nidia Alvarez. By that time, the case had become well known, and the press had given it full attention. Despite everything Nidia had suffered, she showed her enormous heart as a mother during her conversation with journalists. She always stated that her greatest fear during all those years of subjugation was that her children might become victims of assaults like she was. Nidia maintained that this was something she never allowed, and she also stated that every interaction with her father made her feel very bad, and she did not want the story to repeat with her daughters, a point she had made very clear to Arcadio, warning him that if he ever laid a hand on any of her daughters, that would be the end of the docile and good person he had known. She hinted in her interaction with the media that she also resented that what was happening to her was an open secret and no one offered her the least bit of support. She confirmed that she never gave birth in a health center. All her childbirths were attended by midwives at home who knew the situation, but only asked if the new baby was the child of the same father. By that time, her oldest child was 19 years old, and the youngest was only 1 year old. In 2009, the trial against Arcadio ended, with no further details found, except, of course, that in response to the accused's claims that Nidia was not his biological daughter, comparative DNA tests were ordered. The Colombian Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed that the man was lying, as the tests proved she was indeed his daughter. It was also revealed that the prosecution originally tried to add an additional charge for sexual acts against a minor under 14 years of age for an alleged abuse against one of his daughters, but the fact could never be proven, and in the end, the prosecution dropped this charge. The media reported that in the initial session, Arcadio pleaded innocent, but after 12 hours of hearing, Nidia's valuable testimony, and the DNA evidence, the accused ended up accepting the charges against him and even apologized to his daughter and his grandchildren. With his admission of guilt in October 2009, the presiding judge sentenced Arcadio Alvarez to 15 years and 7 months in prison, a sentence that undoubtedly seemed almost an offense to the victims and did not take into account the number of people whose lives were severely affected. And there was yet another incomprehensible detail. Although the reasons were not found, the sentence was later reduced to 11 years, 7 months, and some days. After the trial and under the protection of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, Nidia and her 6 younger children were relocated and placed in a house in good condition in Bogotá, the country's capital, with the aim of starting a new life away from the place where everyone knew them and would constantly remind them of what had happened. This is the last information that could be found about this family. And talking about Arcadio, the insufficient sentence was not even fully served. As in 2011, the authorities of that institution reported that Arcadio had died. According to a press release issued by the prison authorities 2 weeks before, the individual had been hospitalized for surgery due to gallstones. But the day after being discharged and returned to prison, the guards found him dead in his cell. The report stated that the death occurred due to natural causes. At the end of this case, the lesson of Nydia's courage and her struggle to provide for her surviving children remained. But the undeniable pain of so many years and the deaths of 6 little ones, either because their pregnancies did not come to term or due to being born under inadequate conditions, was undoubtedly very difficult to overcome. At the time of the events, the director of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare stated that he had never known a case of this magnitude in Colombia and expressed concern that a situation of so many years had not been denounced by anyone. The official was not only referring to a complaint from the victim, who was the most fragile and had the least opportunity to do so, but also to the community members who knew about the situation but chose to remain silent. In a conversation with the press, one of the sons who stayed with the father tried to make sense of the events from his humble point of view. But the truth is that nothing justifies what happened in this case. Nydia lived for about 30 years dreaming for freedom, but without the courage to obtain it, as the abuse started at such a young age that it left her unable to defend herself. Inside, she was a terrified child, even at the age of 30. After finally being freed from her abusive father, the woman stated that all that went through her mind was the hope that her children could have a better future, that they would study to progress in life, form their homes, and feel at peace. And perhaps the great lesson of this case is advice for other women that Nydia repeated several times to the media. She pointed out that if they found themselves in a similar situation, they should find a way to speak out, to denounce, and trust in God to move forward. For Nydia, silence was her father's perfect accomplice, not just her own silence, but that of all those who, knowing the situation, preferred to look the other way. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon. "20 years ago, Rachel, a 21-year-old, was making the 20-minute journey to her home from her parents' house in the early hours of New Year's Day 2003. She had spent the evening celebrating at a pub with friends and family. She had stopped off at her parents' house in Hall Road, North Hull, to get changed into her trainers before making the 20-minute walk back to her flat in Sachs Court, Orchard Park. Her mother pleaded with her not to go because it was too late. But her beloved kittens, Speedy Tomato and Batman, were home alone after her boyfriend had decided to go to a party. Rachel promised to call when she got home. She never did. Rachel Morin was born on January 17, 1981, in England, and was the youngest of 4 siblings, having 2 sisters and 1 brother. They all lived together in their hometown. From an early age, Rachel developed a keen interest in music and dance, particularly ballet. She excelled academically in school and later attended a local college to study information technology. However, she eventually decided to focus on her passion for dance. In college, Rachel met a young man named Mark, and they soon started dating. They decided to move in together and rented an apartment in a quiet residential area, which was only a kilometer away from Rachel's parents' home, allowing her to visit them frequently. Rachel also found a job at a local bakery, where she enjoyed decorating cakes. This experience sparked her interest in pursuing a culinary education. In December 2002, when Rachel was 21, she and Mark adopted 2 kittens. They were both very attentive to the pets, ensuring they were never left alone for long periods. As a result, Rachel and Mark always planned their activities to ensure someone was home to care for the animals. This included their New Year's Eve plans, where Mark was to visit his parents and return in the evening, while Rachel planned to go to a bar with her brother to celebrate. On the night of December 31st, Rachel met up with her brother, and they went to a bar, joined by some friends. After midnight, Rachel and her brother left the bar and arrived at their parents' house around 1:20 a.m. Before going to bed, Rachel decided to call Mark to check on him but found he was not home. She reached him on his mobile phone, and he informed her that he was at a party with friends. Disappointed that Mark had left the house and the kittens alone, Rachel decided to go back to their apartment instead of staying at her parents' house. Her mother tried to dissuade her from leaving due to the late hour and concerns for her safety, even though the apartment was only a kilometer away. After a long discussion, Rachel left for home, promising to call her mother upon arrival. However, after waiting for about an hour and a half without receiving a call, Rachel's mother tried to reach her both on her mobile phone and at the apartment but got no response. Rachel Moran's mother grew increasingly worried when she could not reach her daughter, suspecting that Rachel might have gone to the party where her boyfriend was and hence was not answering the calls. After trying to contact her until 4:30 a.m., the mother decided to go to sleep. She woke up around 10 a.m. and found her husband on the phone, hoping he was talking to Rachel. However, it was their eldest daughter on the line, who had been unable to reach Rachel all morning and was very worried. Realizing that Rachel had not returned home, the family began to panic. They tried calling her again, and after some time, Mark answered. He was surprised when asked if Rachel was home. He said he had returned around 7 a.m. and found that Rachel wasn't there. Assuming she had stayed at her parents' house, he didn't think much of it and went to sleep. According to Mark, there were no signs that Rachel had been in the apartment. Her belongings were not there, the bed was as he left it, and the kittens had not been fed. This escalated the family's panic. The family called Rachel's friends and other relatives, but no one had seen her that night. Subsequently, Rachel's parents decided to inform the police. Although Rachel was almost 22 years old and the police might typically wait before starting a search for a missing adult, they decided to begin the search immediately in this case. They inspected her apartment and interviewed all her family members and friends. The police quickly ruled out the possibility that Rachel had left of her own free will, given her background and the accounts of her loved ones. During the investigation, Rachel's mother recalled a moment from the night Rachel disappeared. When Rachel was leaving for her apartment, they had a discussion literally at the doorstep, standing with the door open as her mother tried to convince her to stay. At one point, an unknown man passed by the street. Rachel's mother even considered asking him to accompany her daughter home, but decided against it. After receiving a basic description of the man seen near Rachel Moran's location, the police began searching for him, as he was headed in the same direction as Rachel shortly after her departure. This individual might have witnessed something relevant. Police units were alerted while the search for other clues continued. Investigators started scrutinizing Mark, Rachel's boyfriend. First, it was discovered that there had been an argument between them that night when Rachel found out he had gone to a party. Secondly, during his interactions with the police, Mark did not appear distressed despite his girlfriend's disappearance. These factors led the investigators to consider the possibility of his involvement in her disappearance, prompting them to verify his alibi. Mark stated he returned from the party after 6 a.m. The police confirmed his statement by speaking with people present at the party. Rachel's relatives also insisted that Mark would never harm her. Investigators requested Rachel's mobile operator and bank data, and found that she had not used her phone or bank card since her disappearance. At that time, mobile phone geolocation tracking and cellular tower data were not sophisticated enough to be useful, especially over short distances. The police decided to obtain all surveillance camera recordings within a 10-kilometer radius of her route. Patrols were dispatched to each store, and residents in these areas were interviewed, hoping someone might have security cameras installed. Soon, they spotted Rachel on one of the cameras, just a few hundred meters from her residential complex, confirming she was heading home and not elsewhere. The search was intensified in this area, involving search dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers combing streets, fields, and bodies of water. Streams and artificial channels were drained in the search, but these efforts yielded no results. As time passed, the police increasingly suspected that Rachel might no longer be alive, but the search continued on a larger scale. 2 weeks later, a concerning clue emerged. One of the channels near Rachel's apartment was drained, and her shoe, which she had worn when leaving her mother's house, was found. The following day, a trash bag was discovered in the same channel, containing a woman's purse with cosmetics, a mobile phone, and other items, including Rachel Moran's passport. These findings led Rachel's family and the investigators to believe she was probably deceased, and the police continued scouring the channels. There was a possibility that an unknown perpetrator had disposed of Rachel's body there, but further searches led to no additional discoveries. In the subsequent days, detectives dedicated even more effort to the case, deciding to resort to a popular tactic in England. The police found a woman who resembled Rachel Moran and dressed her in clothes similar to those Rachel wore on the night of her disappearance. They asked her to follow the same route Rachel took, and this reenactment was recorded and broadcast on local television channels. The purpose of this experiment was to find witnesses who might have seen Rachel on the night she disappeared but didn't think much of it, or had simply forgotten. The visual recreation of the scene was successful in jogging memories, and several people contacted the police with their observations after the broadcast. While these testimonies were ultimately not very helpful to the case, the detectives did gain some significant leads. In addition to witnesses, owners of surveillance cameras in the area also approached the police. Initially, the police had received most of these recordings, but some had been overlooked and proved to be fruitful. The administration of a school located about 150 meters from Rachel's apartment provided footage from the night in question. The quality was poor, but the police saw a woman heading towards the apartment complex and, seconds later, someone following her. They suspected this individual might be the unknown offender who could have attacked Rachel. However, the poor quality of the footage prevented identification of any distinguishing features. The police theorized that if the person responsible for Rachel's disappearance was this individual, they couldn't have transported her body too far without a car. They assumed the perpetrator lived in the area and decided to attempt to search every house within a 2-kilometer radius. This required residents' permission and considerable time, so over 100 officers were involved, knocking on doors and requesting to inspect properties. The search began on January 28th, with officers divided into groups, each accompanied by a specialist in property inspection. Hours into the search, one of the teams encountered something alarming at the last unit. The police were allowed inside by a man who answered the door, but initially found nothing suspicious. Before leaving, an officer noticed a small closet used for storing garbage, which was locked. The man couldn't recall where the key was, but eventually found it. When the officers opened the closet, they discovered numerous trash bags, empty boxes, and other objects. As they cleared the clutter, an officer noticed a human foot in one of the bags. Upon further inspection, they realized they had found the body of Rachel Moran. Wrapped in a blanket and tightly squeezed into the closet, which was very low, The officers were astounded at how the criminal managed to fit a human body in there. They immediately arrested the apartment owner, 23-year-old Michael Little, and his friend who was present during the visit. Little reacted calmly to his arrest, while his friend was shocked and confused about why they were being detained. After the arrest, the officers called the chief detective and waited for his arrival. They took Little's friend to the station while Little remained in the apartment with an officer, waiting for the next team. The officer decided to engage Little in conversation, and to his surprise, Little almost immediately began confessing in detail. Little expressed relief at being found, saying he had long wanted to tell someone. He narrated the sequence of events leading to the girl's death, but the officer found his version dubious. According to Little, on New Year's Eve, he saw Rachel on the street, approached her and talked to her, offering to go to his apartment. Rachel agreed, and they went to his place where they drank a bit. Then they argued over something unspecified. Little claimed he went to another room and, upon returning to the kitchen, found Rachel with her back to him, holding a knife. When she turned towards him and cut his hand, he panicked, grabbed a kitchen knife, and struck her, causing her death. The officer doubted the truthfulness of this story, as it seemed quite illogical. Nevertheless, he recorded Little's confession, and Little was soon taken to the station. During the interrogation, Little maintained his claim of self-defense. When asked why he didn't call the police, Little said he was scared and thought no one would believe him, so he decided to hide the body in his closet. Further investigation into Little's background revealed a significant criminal history. From a young age, he was caught stealing and committing other minor offenses. He was expelled from school several times, failing to obtain even a basic education. Little barely worked, stayed at home, and consumed alcohol and drugs. His acquaintances mentioned that Little often fantasized about meeting different women. He once even claimed he was dating a very tall and beautiful blonde girl. Although Little's friends knew he was not actually in any relationship, this detail caught the detective's attention. Rachel matched the description of the type of woman Little often fantasized about, approximately the same height and blonde hair. The detectives hypothesized that Little might have chosen Rachel as his victim based on these characteristics. They also established that Rachel did not know Little, despite living on nearby streets. The investigators reconstructed the timeline of that night and found that Little had been with his friends on the evening of December 31st, preparing to celebrate the new year. However, Little left their company in a rage because the girl he was trying to flirt with had left with his friend. He then headed to another party and left shortly after midnight, following a route that intersected with Rachel's path. Upon reviewing all available facts, the detectives came to an alarming conclusion. They recalled the stranger who passed by Rachel and her mother while the latter was pleading with her daughter not to walk home alone. The police suspected that this man was Little, a theory indirectly confirmed by surveillance camera footage. The recording showed a man resembling Little passing by shortly before Rachel, and in a subsequent recording, an unknown man was seen walking behind her. If this man was Little, he must have stopped somewhere to wait for Rachel to pass and then began following her. This scenario contradicted Little's own story. Further contradictions emerged after medical experts presented their report. Rachel's body had 27 stab wounds inflicted with great force, and she had no defensive wounds, contrary to Little's claim of a fight between them. Additionally, some of the wounds were inflicted from behind and no cuts were found on Little's hands. These facts unequivocally indicated that his story did not match reality. Based on all the available data, the detectives formulated a more plausible version of events. On that night, Little, feeling spurned from being rejected at the first party, passed by Rachel's mother's house. Hearing part of their conversation, he understood that Rachel would be walking home alone. She fit the type of woman he fantasized about, so he decided to attack her or try to talk to her. He advanced a bit, stepped off the main street and waited for Rachel to pass, then began following her. The situation could have developed in two scenarios. Either he attacked her immediately or attempted to flirt with her. In the scenario where Rachel might have ignored Little and walked away, there were several reasons for this. Firstly, she had a boyfriend. Secondly, she would not go to the home of a stranger who approached her on the street in the middle of the night. And thirdly, Rachel was very concerned about her kittens. Upon learning that her boyfriend had left them alone all night, she was focused on getting home as quickly as possible. The most likely scenario was that Little attacked Rachel when she was close to her home and dragged her to his apartment. Criminologists found evidence supporting this theory. There were mud stains on the back of Rachel's legs, indicating she had been dragged along the ground. They also determined that the murder did not occur in the kitchen, but in the hallway, where most of the bloodstains were found and which the criminal tried to clean. Despite all this, forensic experts determined that Rachel had been sexually assaulted, and Little's DNA was found on her body. This indicated that Rachel could have been dead by the time these events occurred. Based on all this evidence, murder charges were filed against Little on January 31st. However, he had hired a lawyer by then and retracted his initial statements, claiming he had not killed anyone. Eventually, the case went to trial in October, where Little's lawyers presented a new version of events. Little now claimed that his friend was the actual murderer. This was the same friend who was arrested with him on the day Rachel's body was discovered but was later released due to a lack of evidence linking him to the case. According to Little, he returned home early in the morning and found his friend and Rachel there. He claimed his friend had met Rachel and decided to go to his apartment because he had the keys. The three of them drank together, and then Rachel and Little went to the bedroom and had sexual relations. Shortly after, his friend burst into the room, angry, feeling sympathy for the girl, and enraged upon discovering their relationship. He grabbed a knife and stabbed Rachel multiple times, then threatened Little. Little demanded that his friend help him clean up the blood and never speak of what happened. Otherwise, he threatened to kill not only Little, but also his loved ones. As one might expect, no one believed this story. It contradicted the evidence and common sense. All indications pointed to Little as the real murderer, with no evidence implicating his friend. The trial concluded fairly quickly since the defense could not present any evidence to refute their client's guilt. As a result, Little was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. If his parole application is approved, he could be released at the age of 58. Rachel's murder was a devastating blow to all her family members, but her older sister, who suffered from diabetes, was particularly affected. The stress of the situation severely impacted her health. After a long struggle, she passed away in 2010, and her family blames Little for her death as well. Thus, the actions of this criminal led to 2 tragic losses. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon.